The bells of St. Andrew's struck midnight with a sonorous clang that echoed through the fog-laden streets of Bloomsbury. Their solemn peal seemed to bleed into the narrow lane behind Harrington's antiquarian clocks, where a constable's whistle pierced the night air. By the time Inspector Charles Weatherby arrived, the little shop was lit with the pale glow of gas lamps, and a small knot of onlookers had gathered at the entrance, murmuring in hushed tones as though afraid to speak too loudly in the presence of death. Inside, the scene was disconcertingly orderly. Glass cabinets gleamed, each filled with intricate timepieces, pendulums swaying softly, ticking in a chorus of mechanical hearts. Yet behind the counter, sprawled across the worn Turkish rug, lay the lifeless form of Edward Harrington himself, the most respected horologist in London. His face was pale, his spectacles askew, and his right hand clutched a small brass winding key. As though it were some final message he had no time to complete. The constable who had discovered the body shuffled nervously when Weatherby fixed him with a look. "Door was locked, sir. Windows too. We had to force the back entrance to get in. But there's something odd." He gestured toward the array of clocks. Weatherby followed his gaze, and his brow furrowed. Every clock in the shop, grandfather, carriage, mantel, and wall alike, had been stopped at precisely 11 o'clock. Not one ticked. Not one pendulum swung. It was as though time itself had died alongside its master. The inspector crouched to examine the corpse. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious wound except a thin line across Harrington's throat, shallow, almost delicate, as if inflicted by a razor or some finely honed blade. Yet there was remarkably little blood, only a faint smear on the collar of his shirt. No weapon lay nearby, no clue as to how an intruder could have entered or left. The locked doors and shuttered windows mocked the inspector's sense of reason. Natural causes, perhaps, ventured the constable, though even he sounded unconvinced. Weatherby shook his head. Men do not slit their own throats so neatly, and clocks do not all stop at once by accident. Someone wanted us puzzled, constable, and they've succeeded. By dawn, the crime scene was secured and news had already spread across the city. Edward Harrington was no ordinary shopkeeper. His clientele included peers of the realm, foreign dignitaries, even the crown itself. His death, particularly under such inexplicable circumstances, was not merely a tragedy but a scandal waiting to explode. The inspector's first inquiries led him to Harrington's apprentice, a nervous young man named Simon Fielding. Simon had discovered his employer's absence when he arrived early to work and found the constable already there. Pale, with ink-stained fingers, Simon stammered as he tried to explain himself. Mr. Harrington was working late last night. He had a commission, a rare French timepiece, to repair. He often stayed past midnight, but he never let me help. Said I lacked the precision. I left him here about 10. Did he seem troubled? Weatherby asked. Simon hesitated. He was distracted, I suppose. I heard him muttering about a man, an old client who had returned after years abroad. Said he wanted a clock restored, but there was something in his tone, like he was afraid. I didn't press him. The inspector leaned back, studying the boy. Fear flickered in his eyes, but whether it was guilt or grief, Weatherby could not yet say. He pressed further. Did you lock up when you left? Yes, sir. The front and back both, and the windows, always. Mr. Harrington was particular about that. Said clocks could be stolen in seconds but took lifetimes to perfect. The words struck Weatherby as more than a craftsman's pride. They sounded like a warning. But warnings were useless when their meaning came too late. Later that day, the inspector met with Mrs. Harrington, a widow now pale with shock. She had little to offer, save for one detail that deepened the mystery. "Last night," she whispered, "I woke suddenly at 11. I can't say why. It was as though a noise disturbed me, though the house was quiet. Only I noticed the clock on the landing had stopped, at exactly 11. I thought it odd, but I went back to bed. When I awoke again, all the clocks in the house were the same. 11 o'clock. Frozen, the inspector's pen hovered over his notebook. All of them. Yes, every one. Except Edward's pocket watch. That was still ticking. A shiver coursed down Weatherby's spine. Either Harrington's killer had orchestrated this grotesque stillness, or Edward himself had left behind some intricate message. Yet if it were the latter, it remained as unfathomable as the inner workings of the clocks themselves. By evening, the coroner delivered his report. The cut to Harrington's throat was precise, almost surgical. Death had been swift, but the lack of blood suggested the wound had been inflicted post-mortem, or at least under circumstances that defied ordinary expectation. More curiously, traces of oil and fine brass dust were found upon his clothing, though Harrington's hands were scrubbed clean. The inspector frowned. Why would a craftsman die spotless, while his garments bore the mark of his trade? As the second night fell, Weatherby sat in his study, surrounded by scattered notes and sketches of the scene. He could not dismiss the locked room puzzle, nor the eerie silence of so many clocks halted at once. The winding key clutched in the dead man's hand haunted him most of all. Was it merely coincidence? A craftsman's instinctive grip on his tools at the moment of death? Or had Harrington intended it as his last, desperate message? He had no answers yet, only questions that deepened with every tick of his own Mantell clock. But as midnight neared and the bell of St. Andrews tolled once more, Inspector Weatherby felt certain of one thing. The man who had silenced Edward Harrington had done so with exquisite care, and with a mind as precise and deliberate as the inner wheels of the clocks themselves. And somewhere, hidden in the stillness of 11 o'clock, lay the secret that would turn this baffling crime from unsolvable mystery into revelation. The morning after Harrington's death, Inspector Weatherby sat in the cramped office of the Yard, his notes spread across the desk in a jumble of diagrams, times, and witness statements. He had not slept, the case refused to loosen its grip. A murder with no weapon, no blood, no forced entry, and the bizarre halting of every clock at the same moment. It felt less like a crime than a conjuring trick. Yet conjuring tricks always had their secrets, if one could look closely enough. That was precisely why Lord Peter Wimsey was sent for. By mid-afternoon, a familiar figure strolled into the clockmaker's shop, tall and languid, his monocle glinting in the muted light, as though amused by the gravity of the situation. Wimsey's manner was deceptively casual, his drawl light as he greeted Weatherby. "Inspector, you do have a gift for stumbling into the dramatic. A murdered horologist, a shop full of silent clocks. Why, it sounds like a riddle set by some devilish examiner. What's the prize for solving it? A lifetime subscription to the Horological Gazette." Weatherby bristled, but said nothing. He knew better than to be fooled by Wimsey's airy humor. Behind that languid mask lay a razor-keen mind, one that had unraveled puzzles more complex than most men could dream of. Wimsey moved through the shop with the unhurried grace of a man surveying an art gallery. He bent to examine the glass cabinets, trailed a finger along the mahogany counter, paused to study the grandfather clocks looming against the wall. "So," he murmured, "every one of these fellows stopped at precisely 11 A. Extraordinary coincidence, or extraordinary precision. And our poor Mr. Harrington obligingly expired not long after. Tell me, Inspector, was the wound deep?" "Not particularly." Shallow but neat, Weatherby replied, watching him closely. Neat, yes. One might almost call it deliberate understatement. Whimsy crouched beside the rug where Harrington had been found. The body had been taken away, yet Whimsy traced the outline as though the dead man were still present. And this little trinket? He held up the brass winding key, now sealed in an evidence pouch. Our victim clutched it as though it were a talisman. Curious choice for a dying message. Not exactly universal language, is it? The inspector leaned on his cane. Could have been reflex. A man dies where he works, he holds what's in his hand. Perhaps. Or perhaps he meant us to see it. The trouble with messages, Inspector, is that they rarely speak in plain English. Whimsy rose and drifted toward the far end of the shop. A wall clock stood there, its ornate case carved with leaves and cherubs. Something about it made him pause. He tapped the glass lightly. This one, Inspector. Have you noticed? The hands point to 11, like all the others, but look more closely. Weatherby frowned and peered in. It was true, while the hands rested on 11. The second hand was wedged not between the marks, but slightly bent, as though forced. Tampered with? Indeed, someone set this clock, not stopped it. And not very gently either. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. The question is, why go to such lengths to make us believe every clock died at once? What does 11 o'clock mean to our murderer? Before Weatherby could reply, the door opened and Simon Fielding, the apprentice, stepped nervously inside. He had been summoned to provide further testimony, yet his face grew pale as he saw Whimsy studying him with that calm, unblinking gaze. "Ah, Mr. Fielding," Whimsy greeted him lightly, adjusting his monocle. "You left your master at 10, I believe. And you were certain he seemed, what was the word, distracted?" "Yes, sir," Simon murmured. Distracted men seldom complete their tasks neatly. Yet Mr. Harrington's workbench is spotless. Not a screw out of place, not a gear abandoned mid-motion. Fascinating restraint for a man in turmoil. Unless, of course, someone tidied it afterward. Simon's eyes flickered, just for a second, before he swallowed and looked at the floor. Whimsy caught the motion instantly, though his tone remained mild. "Tell me, my lad. This rare French piece he was repairing. Where is it?" Simon hesitated too long. I don't know. Perhaps upstairs." Weatherby's eyes narrowed. "You told me yesterday he was working on it late into the night. Yet now you can't say where it is." I must have been mistaken," Simon stammered, wringing his hands. Whimsy's voice was soft, almost sympathetic. A dangerous thing to be mistaken at such a time. Clocks don't simply vanish, you know. They tick, they tock, they leave trails. Much like people. He turned back to the inspector. "I should very much like to see Harrington's private workshop." Upstairs. The room was dim and close with the scent of brass polish and old wood. On the bench lay a scatter of tools, neatly arranged, though Whimsy noted the faint smudge of oil along the drawer handles. Oil that did not match the polished, clean tools themselves. He pulled open a drawer. Empty. Another, also empty. The third, however, revealed something unexpected, a length of fine wire, coiled carefully, its end stained faintly red. Whimsy held it up between finger and thumb. "Inspector, do you see? Not a blade, not a razor, but this." A wire, strong and thin. It would leave just such a shallow line upon the throat, and with skill, it could kill silently, quickly. Weatherby's jaw tightened. Strangled, then. And the cut, an illusion. Precisely. Illusion layered upon illusion. Our murderer is an artist of deception. Yet even as Whimsy spoke, he noticed something else, a small scrap of parchment tucked beneath the bench leg, almost hidden from sight. He plucked it out and read the faint, Hurried script at 11, all will stop. Do not trust him. The detective's expression sharpened. Someone had known. Someone had left a warning. But to whom? And who was the mysterious him? As they descended the stairs, Simon hovered near the doorway, his face strained. Whimsy studied him once more. "You're young, my boy, but your nerves betray you. Did Harrington confide his fear to you? Did he tell you whom he mistrusted?" Simon shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Nothing." Yet the tremor in his voice, the sheen of sweat on his temple, spoke volumes. Whimsy let it pass for now. He turned back to the silent room of clocks, each frozen at 11, each a mute witness to the crime. The inspector sees routine, locked doors, tidy tools, absence of struggle. But I see performance. Our killer staged this room as one sets a stage. The clocks are props, the wire the hidden mechanism, the key the cryptic clue. All very carefully arranged to bewilder us. He glanced at Weatherby. His smile faint but knowing. And when a man arranges a stage, Inspector, he cannot help but leave behind a thread of truth woven among the lies. We must simply look where no one else thinks to. The inspector nodded slowly, beginning to feel that familiar unease whenever Whimsy's eyes gleamed with certainty. Somewhere within this shop, perhaps even within the apprentice's faltering words, lay the first crack in the murderer's deception. And once Whimsy pulled at it, the whole performance might come undone. The note tucked beneath Harrington's bench lingered in Whimsy's mind as he and Inspector Weatherby began the slow, meticulous work of interviewing those tied to the dead clockmaker. The warning, at 11, all will stop. Do not trust him, was a splinter lodged under the skin of the case, small but impossible to ignore. It was clear Harrington had feared someone, and perhaps someone close. Fear rarely sprang fully formed without cause. Their first visit was to Mrs. Harrington, pale and wan in her sitting room, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. Her hands twisted the edge of her shawl as Whimsy's gentle tone coaxed her to recount the night once more. "You say you woke at 11, Mrs. Harrington. Did you hear anything unusual? Footsteps, voices, the door?" She shook her head, lips trembling. "No? Only that the clocks had stopped. It seemed uncanny. But Edward was often working late. He said his customers demanded perfection, and he could not rest until he achieved it." Did he mention anyone who troubled him recently? Anyone who brought him more than a clock to mend? Her eyes darted away. He had many clients, Lord Whimsy. Men of standing. I never pried into his business. Yet even as she spoke, her voice carried the faintest quaver, the hesitancy of someone concealing more than she admitted. Weatherby leaned forward. "Your husband's apprentice told us Harrington feared an old client who returned. Do you know who that might have been?" A pause. Then too quickly, "No. I know nothing of it." Whimsy caught the flicker in her eyes before she lowered them. She was lying, perhaps not about the man's identity, but about knowing nothing. He let it pass for now, bowing his head in sympathy. "Very well, madam. Thank you for your courage. It cannot be easy." "Outside," he murmured to Weatherby, "she hides something. Fear makes people whisper, but guilt makes them stammer." "Did you notice her haste to deny?" The inspector grunted. "I noticed. But women in grief are not always precise. Perhaps. Or perhaps precision is exactly what frightens her." Next they sought Simon Fielding again, summoning him to the yard. He sat in the stark room with shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously between Whimsy and Weatherby. This time, the detective pressed him harder. "You told us your master worked on a French piece. Yet there was no such clock in the shop. Did you invent it?" Simon's hands clenched. "No, sir. There was one, a gilt ormolu mantel clock. He'd been repairing it for weeks. But, he hesitated, swallowing. When I returned the next morning it was gone. Gone? Weatherby snapped. Stolen? You mean? I don't know. Perhaps Mr. Harrington put it away. Whimsy said softly. Or perhaps someone took it, knowing it would reveal more than they wished. Where did the clock come from? Simon licked his lips. I shouldn't say. Shouldn't. Whimsy's monocle gleamed. My dear boy, men have been hanged for less silence than yours. Speak. It belonged to a gentleman, Simon whispered. Mr. Felix Rowland. He brought it in 3 weeks ago. Said it was a family piece. But Mr. Harrington didn't want to take it. He argued. Said Rowland should find another craftsman. Then later, he agreed. I don't know why. Whimsy exchanged a glance with the inspector. Felix Rowland. A name at last. Thank you, Simon. Though you might have spared us the roundabout. The boy flushed, ashamed. Rowland was easily traced, a barrister of good standing, known for his charm and expensive tastes. He received them at his chambers with polished courtesy, though Whimsy saw the flicker of annoyance at their intrusion. Yes, Harrington did some work for me, Rowland admitted smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. A valuable clock, a French piece. He was the only man in London capable of handling it properly. I trusted him implicitly. Curious, Whimsy said lightly. His apprentice suggested you argued when you brought it. Rowland's smile tightened. Nonsense. Harrington was eccentric, yes, but he never refused my commissions. Perhaps the boy misheard. Perhaps. Yet the clock is missing now. Whimsy let the words hang. Rowland did not flinch, but his hand tapped once on the armrest before stilling. I expect Harrington completed the repair and stored it safely. His death is a tragedy, but surely you don't imagine I've... He gave a thin laugh. Inspector, I was at the club that night, until after midnight. Many gentlemen can vouch for me. Weatherby scribbled a note. Whimsy simply inclined his head. How very convenient to be surrounded by witnesses. They left Rowland's chambers with the taste of polished lies still in the air. Whimsy's voice was quiet as they walked. He is too eager, Inspector. Too polished. Truth rarely wears such a perfect coat. And did you notice the hand? A nervous tap, quickly stilled. Rowland is no stranger to tension. The next witness was Harrington's neighbor, Mrs. Grant, a widow who lived above the confectioner's next door. She had been among the first to hear the constable's whistle that night. She was eager, perhaps too eager, to be helpful. Oh yes, I saw Mr. Harrington that evening, she told them brightly. About 10:30 it must have been. He was at the shop door, locking it. I remember, because I just returned from visiting my sister in Holborn, and I wished him good night. He looked well, very well. Not troubled at all. Weatherby frowned. You're certain it was 10:30? Quite certain. I checked my watch when I came in. A present from my son, you see. I'm never without it. Her certainty rang oddly against Simon's testimony. The boy had insisted Harrington was still working at 10 when he left. If Mrs. Grant was right, Harrington had locked the door by 10:30. But Harrington had been found inside long after midnight, dead. When they left, Whimsy spoke quietly. One of them misremembers, or one of them lies. Which is more dangerous, Inspector? Weatherby scowled. The apprentice may be mistaken. The neighbor may want attention. Or both. Just so. But notice Mrs. Grant was very eager. People who are very eager often embroider their stories, if not invent them outright. The final visit of the day was to Harrington's rival, Mr. Cecil Price, who ran another clock shop a few streets away. He received them with solemn courtesy, yet his eyes glittered faintly when Harrington's death was mentioned. A sad loss, gentlemen. Though perhaps not unexpected, Harrington was secretive, reclusive, far too consumed by his obsessions. He drove clients away with his prickliness. Why, only last month I heard him railing against some barrister fellow. Roland, was it? Said the man was dangerous. Whimsy leaned forward. Dangerous in what way? Price shrugged. I couldn't say. But Harrington was unsettled. He even hinted that Roland threatened him. Of course, Edward was dramatic by nature, always imagining slights. Weatherby eyed him coldly. You didn't care for him. Professional rivalry, nothing more. I respected his skill. Yet Whimsy caught the flicker of satisfaction that Price could not conceal. Competitors rarely grieve over rivals, and sometimes rivalry provided both motive and opportunity. By the time dusk fell, Whimsy and Weatherby sat once more amid the silent clocks, their notes brimming with contradictions. Mrs. Harrington withheld truths. Simon fumbled, torn between fear and honesty. Roland polished his words too carefully. Mrs. Grant offered eager certainty that rang false. Price spoke too freely of threats he claimed to know little about. Deceptions everywhere. Weatherby muttered, rubbing his brow. Each gives us a piece, yet none fits. Whimsy smiled faintly, watching the shadows lengthen across the frozen dials. Ah, but lies are as useful as truths, Inspector. A lie is a signpost, pointing us toward what someone fears most. And somewhere among these voices of deception lies the hand that silenced Harrington at 11 o'clock. The evening fog drifted low across the street as Whimsy lingered in Harrington's silent shop, his eyes fixed upon the frozen dials that stared back at him like blind witnesses. Weatherby, seated heavily at the counter with his notebook open, muttered irritably as he reread the contradictions laid bare by their questioning. Every one of them has reason enough to wish Harrington dead, the inspector said. The apprentice hides something, the wife conceals more. Roland lies through his teeth, the neighbor may be inventing tales, and the rival practically gloated at the news. Motive is not scarce, Whimsy. It is abundant. Abundance, Inspector, Whimsy murmured, is precisely the problem. Too much fuel and no single fire. It is as though each suspect has supplied one brick, yet none of them has built the house. He began pacing the floor, hands clasped behind his back. Let us take them in turn. Mrs. Harrington, fearful, evasive. Might a wife grow wary of her husband's obsession with time, of his secrets? Certainly. But hers is the fear of discovery, not of guilt. She hides knowledge, not action. Simon, the apprentice, he trembles like a hare, but that is natural enough. His falsehoods are the blunders of youth. Still, he knows more than he dares confess. He paused before the ornate clock with its bent second hand, studying it as though it whispered in return. Roland, now, our polished barrister. He bears the hallmarks of a liar well practiced. An alibi built of club gentlemen is too convenient. And what better way to silence a craftsman than to snuff him out before he could reveal a secret? Perhaps Harrington knew something about that French clock, something Roland could not afford the world to hear. And the rival. Price, Weatherby pressed. A rivalry is the commonest motive of all. Jealousy, spite, greed for clients. He paints Roland as dangerous, perhaps truth, perhaps invention. But his satisfaction in Harrington's death was plain. He gains by his rival's absence, though that does not place the wire in his hand. And Mrs. Grant. Eagerness, too much eagerness. The certainty of 10:30. When the apprentice saw Harrington still labored at his bench, points to embroidery, if not deceit. She wants to be part of the play, Inspector. One must ask why. The inspector scowled, flipping the pages of his notes. So what have we? Motives enough to hang half of London, yet none of them explain why every clock stopped at 11. Precisely. Whimsy's smile was faint, thoughtful. The clocks are the heart of it. Not the motive, but the method, the stage on which the motive plays. He sank into a chair, fingers steepled. Let us weave the threads. Harrington feared someone. He left behind a note warning against a man. Do not trust him. He clutched a winding key. His clothes bore dust and oil, though his hands were clean. He dies beneath a shallow wound that is no wound at all, but the mark of strangulation with wire. Every clock arrested at 11. What does it suggest? A message. A symbol, something Harrington knew was coming, and perhaps tried to resist. Weatherby rubbed his temples. You make it sound theatrical, Whimsy. As though the murder were staged like a performance. Exactly so, and performances demand an audience. They sat in silence for a while, the inspector scribbling notes while Whimsy stared into the gloom. Then Whimsy spoke again, his tone brisker. Let us consider each motive more sharply. Roland, what might bind a barrister to a clockmaker, beyond a simple commission? A family heirloom, yes, but why such secrecy, such quarrel? If the clock held something more, documents, perhaps, or a hidden compartment, then Roland had reason enough to silence Harrington. Fear of exposure, fear of ruin, price, Weatherby said. Greed, plain and simple, true. But greed seldom orchestrates elaborate deception. A rival may poison a rumor, but staging clocks and contriving wires. Too delicate, too clever. Unless, of course, he wished to disguise the simple as complex, and thus mislead. A Mrs. Harrington. A wife might kill for freedom or for another man. Yet I sense no lover in her manner, only dread. She is caught in knowledge she dares not utter. If she knows the murderer's identity, silence may be her protection. And the apprentice? Whimsy smiled slightly. Young Simon is a rabbit caught in a snare. His fear is genuine. But his loyalty to his master runs deep. He may have seen something, perhaps even glimpsed the murderer, but he fears the weight of accusation. His lies are self-preservation, not malice. Weatherby drummed his fingers. And the neighbor? What possible motive there? Attention, Inspector. Some thrive upon it. Yet she may also shield another. Overeager witnesses sometimes weave lies to cover inconvenient truths. Perhaps she protects Roland. Perhaps Price. Or perhaps she simply wished to embroider herself into a story that now threatens to consume her. Whimsy rose suddenly, crossing to the counter where the brass winding key lay under its pouch. He held it up to the light. The key is not for any of the clocks downstairs. It fits a smaller mechanism, perhaps the missing French piece. Why clutch it in death, unless to point toward that very clock? And if Roland's clock is missing, and Harrington dies holding its key, then I dare say the clock itself is the centerpiece of this whole affair. Then Roland is our man. Weatherby said firmly. Perhaps, Whimsy allowed. But consider, if Roland killed Harrington to retrieve his clock, why bother with staging every timepiece at 11? Why not strike swiftly, remove the clock, and vanish? No, the elaborate stopping of time was meant as something more than concealment. It was meant as theater. They were interrupted by a constable bringing word that Roland had been seen visiting Mrs. Harrington 2 days before her husband's death. The meeting had been brief, heated, conducted behind closed doors. Weatherby's brows shot up. That binds them together, then? The widow and the barrister? Or divides them? Whimsy murmured. Was it conspiracy? Or threat? Did Roland press her and she resist? Did Harrington discover it? The motive maze deepens, Inspector. Greed, jealousy, revenge, fear, they all coil about us. Yet none alone explains the crime. As night closed around them, Whimsy stood among the silent clocks once more, listening to their absence of sound. He imagined Harrington at his bench, laboring with care, aware of a shadow lengthening behind him. A clock that held a secret, a client who pressed too hard, a rival who watched with envy, a wife who knew too much, an apprentice who knew too little, and a neighbor who pretended to know more than she did. It was a web indeed, tangled and treacherous. Yet Whimsy's gaze hardened with the quiet certainty of a man who had begun to trace its threads. The key. The missing clock, the frozen hour, he whispered. One motive cannot stand alone. But together, they shape a pattern. The question is not who wanted Harrington dead. It is who needed him silenced at exactly 11 o'clock. Weatherby looked up sharply. And do you know who that is? Not yet, Whimsy said softly, his smile faint and sharp. But the hour is drawing closer. The following morning brought what Inspector Weatherby triumphantly called the turning of the tide. A constable, combing the pawnbrokers in Holborn, had stumbled across the missing French ormolu clock. It sat gleaming under the shop's gaslight, its gilt surface dulled by hurried handling, its mechanism half disassembled. Most damning of all, the pawnbroker swore the man who brought it in was none other than Simon Fielding, the apprentice. Simon was dragged into the yard pale as chalk, protesting through trembling lips. I swear to you, I never touched it. I didn't even know it was missing until you said so. His voice cracked. Desperate, but Weatherby's satisfaction was unshakable. We have the pawnbroker's testimony, the inspector declared. We have the clock. We have the motive, greed. The boy saw his chance and took it. Harrington caught him in the act. He silenced his master with that wire, staged the shop to cover his tracks, then tried to rid himself of the evidence. It is neat as a diagram. Neatness, Whimsy murmured, adjusting his monocle, is not always a virtue in detective work. It too often conceals a lie. But Weatherby was not to be swayed. The papers were summoned. The news fed to eager reporters: apprentice arrested in Harrington murder case. For the city, it was relief; for the yard, a triumph. Yet Whimsy, standing apart in the yard's cold corridor, felt none of the satisfaction that buzzed around him. Simon was a nervous, clumsy liar, yes, but no murderer. The staging of the clocks, the theatrical wound, the cryptic note, these were not the work of a terrified youth. They bore the hand of calculation, of someone who understood not merely how to kill, but how to manipulate appearances. Simon had neither the imagination nor the cunning. When Simon was questioned formally, Whimsy pressed him with quiet persistence. The pawnbroker swears you sold him the clock. Do you deny it? I denied it utterly, Simon cried, eyes wide. I never went there. I wouldn't dare. Harrington trusted me. I could never. His words choked into silence. Whimsy watched him keenly. Then tell me this. Where were you after you left Harrington at 10? I went home. Straight home. My mother will tell you. She already has. Weatherby cut in. But mothers are no alibi. Simon's head drooped. Whimsy let him sit in silence a moment before saying softly, You are frightened of more than accusation, my boy. You are frightened of someone else. Whom do you fear? Simon's lips parted, then closed again. His eyes darted toward the door, as though expecting someone to be listening. He whispered only, I can't say. If I do, I'll be next. That answer, more than any denial, set Whimsy's mind ablaze. That night, Harrington's widow received the news of Simon's arrest with a peculiar calmness. She wept. Yes, but the weeping seemed oddly rehearsed, as though performed for the benefit of her maid who hovered nearby. Whimsy, watching, felt again that gnawing sense of falsehood. If the true killer had been caught, why did Mrs. Harrington's fear still cling to her like a shroud? He returned to the shop alone, lantern in hand, moving among the silent clocks. He set the ormolu clock on the counter, its gilt frame reflecting the light. Something about it troubled him. The mechanism had been tampered with clumsily, as though to hide its true purpose rather than repair it. With delicate fingers, he worked the back panel open. Inside, nestled where the bell should have been, lay a thin compartment. Empty now, but unmistakably meant to hold something. A document, perhaps. A letter, something Roland the barrister might kill to retrieve. Whimsy exhaled slowly. If Simon had pawned the clock, he could not have known its secret. If Roland had arranged the clock's disappearance, he would wish the boy blamed, the trail diverted. And if Harrington discovered the compartment and guessed its contents, then the cryptic note, "Do not trust him," might well have been meant for Roland. He snapped the case shut and smiled faintly, though it was not a smile of victory. "False victory," he murmured. "Simon sits in a cell, but the play is not yet ended. The villain remains in the wings." The following day brought Roland back into the frame. He visited the yard, bold as brass, to protest Simon's innocence. The boy. Ridiculous. Harrington may have feared me, but I would never. He stopped, catching himself, and offered a polished laugh. "Forgive me? I only mean the apprentice is an easy scapegoat. Surely the inspector does not believe this child capable of such a crime." Whimsy, standing beside Weatherby, watched the barrister's performance with amusement. "Curious," he drawled. "Most men would express relief at their own name being cleared. You, Roland, seem more concerned that the boy is blamed. Almost as though his conviction would disturb you." Roland's smile flickered, but only for a moment. "I value justice, Lord Whimsy, nothing more." After he left, Weatherby muttered, "Why defend the boy? If he wants him blamed." "Because," Whimsy said softly, "Roland fears a loose thread. If Simon hangs, the trail may end too abruptly. But if Simon speaks, then Roland must keep watch. That is the measure of a guilty man." By week's end, the city believed the case solved. But Whimsy's mind refused to rest. He returned again and again to the image of Harrington at his bench, the wire tightening, the clock stilled at 11. Who had orchestrated such theatre? Not Simon. Not Price, with his blunt rivalry. No, this was the work of a man who understood appearances, arguments, and deceit, the hand of a barrister accustomed to constructing narratives. The false victory of Simon's arrest had thrown dust in the yard's eyes. But Whimsy knew better. The play was not yet done, and Roland, smiling in his chambers, was waiting for the next act. Lord Peter Whimsy sat in his Piccadilly flat long after midnight, the ormolu clock spread open before him like a dismembered patient on an operating table. The mechanism gleamed under his lamp, but his attention lingered not on its cogs, but on the hollow compartment he had discovered within. What had once been hidden there, and why had it been worth a man's life? He struck a match, lit a cigarette, and let his thoughts circle back like hounds to the scent of the past. Harrington's cryptic note, "Do not trust him," rang in his head. Who was him? Roland, surely. But Harrington's manner of writing suggested an old mistrust, not something sudden. He pulled from his shelves a set of legal directories and began leafing through them. Roland had been called to the bar some 15 years earlier. Harrington had opened his shop not long after. At first glance, their worlds should never have touched. Yet Whimsy's instincts warned him that the bond between victim and barrister stretched back further than anyone supposed. The next morning, he visited the records office. Dust motes floated in shafts of light as clerks fetched out the heavy ledgers. Whimsy's patience, born of fox hunting and crosswords, served him well as he combed through trials from a decade past. Then, With a quiet whistle, he found it Regina v. Percival Hale 1913, burglary, fraud, and receiving stolen goods. Witness for the prosecution 1 Thomas Harrington. Defense counsel, a young barrister by the name of Rowland. The details sharpened as he read. Harrington, then an obscure clock mender, had testified against Hale, a dealer in antiquities, exposing a ring of forgeries passed off as genuine 18th-century French pieces. Rowland, the defense, had fought vigorously but lost. Hale was sentenced to 7 years. The scandal ruined his reputation and, by extension, blighted Rowland's early career. Whimsy closed the ledger with a snap. There it was, the shadow of the past, cast long and deep. Harrington had not merely been a victim. He had been a key player in a case that had destroyed one man's future and bruised another's pride. And Percival Hale, where was he now? Released? Living quietly, or burning still with vengeance? That afternoon he put discreet enquiries to Bunter, whose efficiency in such matters was a thing of beauty. By evening, Bunter returned with news. Hale, my lord, was released in 1920. Took up residence under the name of Mr. Percival Green in Clerkenwell. Runs a small antiques stall in Camden Passage. Whimsy's monocle glittered. Antiques, eh? Once a forger, always a forger. Well done, Bunter. I think we must pay Mr. Green a call. The following day found Whimsy amid the jumble of Camden Passage stalls of silver spoons, faded maps, and chipped porcelain. Hale, or Green, was there, a thick-set man gone to seed, his eyes darting like a fox's. He froze when Whimsy mentioned Harrington's name. Don't know him, Hale muttered. Come, Mr. Hale, Whimsy said lightly. Or shall I call you Green? You were tried in 13. Harrington gave evidence against you. And now, not so many weeks after his death, one of his prized clocks turns up disemboweled, its secret compartment emptied. That tickles me, if I may say so. Hale's hand shook as he set down a porcelain figurine. I've gone straight. I've nothing to do with that. Harrington's dead, isn't he? Then good riddance. He ruined me, ruined Rowland too. Ah, so you do know him, Whimsy smiled. Funny thing, coincidence. The past has such a beastly habit of barging into the present. Hale spat on the ground. Rowland came to me, asked questions. Wanted to know if Harrington still kept certain items. I told him I didn't know, that's all. Leave me be, Lord Whimsy. I've paid my debt. But Whimsy's curiosity was sharpened. Rowland, revisiting the ghosts of Harrington's testimony, sniffing after old secrets. It was beginning to make sense. The clock's hidden compartment must have contained some surviving document from that old forgery case, perhaps proof Rowland had suppressed evidence, or even correspondence tying him to Hale's crimes. If such a paper fell into the wrong hands, Rowland's career would collapse. That evening, Whimsy confronted Inspector Weatherby with his findings. The inspector scowled. You mean to say this isn't about the boy? Nor even about jealousy or greed in the present, but about a trial 10 years ago? Precisely, Whimsy replied. The motive lies not in the present quarrels of a clockmaker, but in the shadows cast by an old betrayal. Harrington had something, proof, a relic, call it what you will. Rowland knew it, he feared it. And Harrington, poor devil, didn't realize how sharp the claws of the past can be. But we've nothing tangible. Weatherby protested. No paper. No witness. True, said Whimsy cheerfully. But the villain's hand is revealed by his eagerness to sweep the board clean. He plants the clock on Simon, arranges for the pawnbroker's testimony, and tries to close the book. But there's still ink in the margins, Inspector. And I intend to read it. Weatherby muttered something unprintable about aristocratic interference, but Whimsy's mind was racing. If Harrington had written that note, do not trust him. He had done so knowing Roland would seek him out. Perhaps he even meant to confront him. And when Roland came, Harrington met his end. The next step was clear: to prove Roland's connection not only to Harrington's death, but to Hale and the old forgery. Somewhere a link remained. A letter, a ledger, a witness overlooked. Whimsy's instincts told him it was there, waiting to be unearthed. As he walked back through the fog, the city's bells chiming midnight, he felt the strands of past and present tightening into one knot. The murder of a clockmaker was not a crime of the moment. It was the echo of a trial, a ruin, a betrayal long ago. And until he severed that knot, the true killer would remain at liberty, smiling in the dark. The fog still clung to Piccadilly when Lord Peter Wimsey rose the following morning, but his mind was alight with clarity. The puzzle had ceased to be about a clockmaker's death. It had become a duel with a clever adversary who thought himself concealed by shadows. Roland had built his life upon appearances, the careful farce aid of the gentleman barrister. But Wimsey suspected that beneath lay a brittle vanity, one that might splinter if struck in the right place. It was not brute evidence that would expose him, but psychology. At breakfast, as Bunter poured the coffee, Wimsey mused aloud. What unnerves a man most, Bunter? A threat to his life, or a threat to his pride? Depends on the man, my lord, said Bunter smoothly. But barristers tend to dislike being shown a fool. Exactly. Wimsey's eyes glinted. Roland played the clever counsel once too often. He thought himself safe in shadows, but perhaps a beam of light will make him stumble. That afternoon he invited Roland to his flat under the pretense of wishing to clear up a few loose ends before Weatherby closed the case. The barrister arrived immaculate as ever, his dark coat pressed, his shoes gleaming. But the set of his jaw betrayed strain. Wimsey welcomed him warmly, poured sherry, and began speaking with apparent carelessness about clocks. You know, Roland, he said, tapping ash delicately into the tray. The curious thing about Harrington's ormolu piece was not its elegance, nor even its striking mechanism, but that little hollow within. Remarkable how a craftsman finds space where none appears to exist, eh? Roland's eyes flickered, barely, but Wimsey caught it. The monocle glinted. Of course, Wimsey continued. The question is, what did Harrington hide there? I imagine a man with enemies might keep an insurance policy. Letters, perhaps, or receipts. Something damning. Roland's lips tightened. If you're suggesting— Oh, not suggesting, Wimsey interrupted cheerfully. Merely speculating. I adore speculation. But here's a riddle. Suppose a man once defended a rogue in court and lost, thereby suffering professional disgrace. Suppose years later, he discovers the witness who ruined him still possesses a certain document proving his complicity with that very rogue. Would he not be tempted to retrieve it, by any means? Roland shot to his feet, face flushing. This is absurd! I shall not sit here and be insulted. Set down, Roland, Wimsey said softly, all levity gone. The command in his voice was sharper than steel. Startled, Roland obeyed before he realized what he had done. The momentary submission told Wimsey volumes. Roland was guilty of something, if not all. Wimsey leaned forward. Let me tell you an anecdote. In 1913 I was abroad, but I have read of it since. Percival Hale the forger, you defended him. Harrington testified against him. Hale was ruined, you suffered disgrace. But here's the twist: Harrington discovered, after the trial, that some of the forgeries were not Hale's work alone. Someone else supplied designs, drawings, legal men's doodles, one might say. He kept them. For insurance. Roland's hand jerked, spilling his sherry. His voice cracked. You're lying! Am I? Then why do you tremble? Roland, Whimsy's eyes bored into him. "Hale hinted as much when I visited him. He said you came sniffing about Harrington's possessions." "And Harrington's note? Ah, you didn't know about that, did you? He wrote, 'Do not trust him.' He meant you." Roland sagged back, pale and sweating. For a moment Whimsy thought he might confess outright, but vanity reasserted itself. "You've no proof," Roland muttered hoarsely. "Nothing but guesses. Perhaps," Whimsy said lightly, "but proof has a way of surfacing. Harrington was meticulous. If one compartment yielded nothing, perhaps another still waits to be discovered." Roland flinched, and that involuntary movement was worth a signed confession. Whimsy filed it away in his mind. He had baited the hook, and the fish had bitten. After Roland departed in angry haste, Whimsy sat with Bunter. "You saw it?" "Perfectly, my lord. He knows where the missing document lies, or knew. At least." "Indeed. And now I intend to smoke him out. He cannot bear the thought of Harrington having hidden something beyond his reach. Let us plant a little rumor, Bunter, that another of Harrington's clocks is to be examined. A fine old bracket clock, with a panel that has not been touched in years. Let us see how our barrister reacts when he believes his secret is about to be prized into daylight." 2 days later, word spread, thanks to Whimsy's carefully loose tongue, that the police had seized another of Harrington's clocks, one destined for a buyer in Bloomsbury. Roland received the tidbit, as Whimsy ensured, and that very night was seen creeping down the alley behind Harrington's shuttered shop. Whimsy, crouched in the fog with Weatherby and Bunter, watched as the respectable barrister jimmied the back door with surprising skill. Inside, Roland moved like a man possessed, pulling drawers, tapping panels, lifting the heavy bracket clock onto the bench. His hands shook as he pried at its case. And when he found nothing at all, he let out a groan of despair that echoed like a confession. The inspector stepped forward. "That's enough, Mr. Roland." Roland whirled, his face twisted. "You don't understand! He kept them. He kept the papers, letters, sketches, proof that I had worked with Hale. I had too. He'd have destroyed me." The words spilled from him before he could bite them back. Then he crumpled into a chair, head in hands. Whimsy removed his monocle, his voice oddly gentle. "There it is, Inspector, the unconventional clue. If you like, not a scrap of paper, but a man's own terror of it. Sometimes, when a man is guilty, the mere suggestion of evidence is enough to unravel him. Roland has supplied the rope. We have only to tighten it." Weatherby looked grimly satisfied as he clapped Roland in irons. Yet Whimsy felt a twinge of melancholy. Another man ruined, not by accident of chance, but by his own pride and fear of exposure. Harrington had mended clocks, but Roland's life was one that no craftsman could repair now. Still, Whimsy reminded himself as they stepped out into the night. Justice was a relentless mechanism, and it had struck the hour once more. The night air clung damp to the fog, veiled streets as Lord Peter Whimsy returned from the arrest, his thoughts circling like restless birds. Roland's outburst had been enough to shatter his farce-aid, enough to give Weatherby grounds to hold him. But not, Whimsy knew, enough to hang the case upon. A barrister's frantic words in an empty workshop could too easily be twisted into something else. The inspector, for once, seemed content. Convinced the matter was sealed, but Whimsy's instincts pricked. Something was missing. Roland's desperation had not been about the charge of murder itself but about documents, proof of an older sin. Those papers, wherever they were, remained unseen, and as long as they lingered in shadows, the case was not finished. Bunter, moving silently about the flat, polished a pair of candlesticks as Whimsy paced. Hayes frightened of what Harrington hid. Whimsy muttered. So frightened he'd risk burglary while under suspicion. And yet, when pressed, he found nothing, which suggests the evidence exists still, somewhere beyond his reach. Bunter, with characteristic understatement, said, "That might tempt others to seek it also, my lord." The words hung, ominous. For Roland had not been the only one to show peculiar interest in Harrington's legacy. More than one suspect had revealed knowledge they should not have had, and more than one had reasons to want inconvenient papers extinguished. 2 days later, Weatherby sent word the seized items from Harrington's workshop were to be catalogued at Scotland Yard. Whimsy, restless, accompanied him to watch. The collection included clocks, boxes of tools, scattered ledgers, and a small locked tin that had been prized from beneath a bench. Whimsy's pulse quickened at sight of the tin. Its weight suggested contents. Papers, perhaps, or something equally incriminating. Weatherby frowned at it, then ordered it placed in the secure evidence room to be examined by a clerk the following morning. That night, Whimsy slept ill, the thought of the tin gnawing at him. It was as though Harrington's shadow hovered at his bedside, whispering that the truth lay within, if only he could reach it before others did. By morning, his unease was vindicated. The clerk reported, pale-faced, that the tin had vanished. Not broken open, not misplaced, vanished, as though spirited away from the locked room itself. The constables swore no one had entered. The keys had not left the inspector's chain. Yet the box was gone, and with it, the promise of certainty. The uproar was immediate. Weatherby raged, berating his men. Suspicion crackled in the air like static. "This is sabotage," he growled. "Someone inside the yard, perhaps bribed." Whimsy, however, stood very still, monocle glinting. His voice was quiet, not bribed, desperate. Someone who knew precisely what that box contained and could not risk its opening. "And if it is gone, Inspector, it is because the guilty hand has reached further than we imagined." It changed the tone of everything. Roland's arrest no longer felt decisive. Indeed, if Roland had not seized the tin, who had? His protestations of ignorance might now ring truer than before. Could it be Latham, the financier with much to lose from exposure? Or Ellen, the housekeeper whose silence concealed more than grief? Or someone not yet fully in sight? That evening Whimsy revisited Ellen, finding her pale and tight-lipped in Harrington's old house. He spoke gently at first, but when he mentioned the missing tin her composure faltered. "He told me," she whispered at last, "that he had kept things that could ruin men if need be. But he swore it was only for protection. He never meant to use them." "Protection," Whimsy echoed softly. "A shield that becomes a sword when it falls into other hands. Tell me, Mrs. Ellen, did he ever hint where it was kept?" Her eyes flickered to the hearth, then back. "He said once, long ago, that the safest place was where no one looked, inside the work of his own hands. The clocks, the benches. He had hiding places in them all." Whimsy left thoughtful, the fog closing about him. If the tin had been stolen, it meant someone had tracked its secret from workshop to yard. Someone who knew Harrington's habits as well as Ellen did. Perhaps better. The following day a fresh blow fell. The ledger from Harrington's bench, which had been in Weatherby's custody, was discovered half burned in the yard's furnace room. Half the pages reduced to ash, the rest charred and illegible. It was no accident. Someone within had risked discovery to obliterate it. The inspector's trust in his men frayed visibly. Every glance became sharp, every order curt. Whimsy, though outwardly calm, felt the pressure mounting. Whoever sought to bury Harrington's secrets had eyes everywhere. The yard was no longer safe ground. Evidence vanished as quickly as it was found. And without evidence, words alone could not hold Roland or anyone else. That night, Bunter returned from an errand with news Roland, though under watch, had been visited by a solicitor who slipped him a note. The guard claimed it was legal correspondence, but Roland had burned it almost immediately after reading. Whimsy pondered this with narrowed eyes. The game is larger than Roland. Someone works with him, or against him. Either way, the hand that destroyed the ledger is the same that carried away the tin. Bunter asked quietly, "Do you suspect the inspector's circle?" "My lord." "Not Weatherby himself, though he may yet be a pawn. But there is a rot in the structure, Bunter. And rot spreads unseen until the beam collapses." Even as he said it, Whimsy felt the walls closing in. Every step forward was met by erasure. Every clue devoured by an invisible adversary. It was no longer merely a matter of solving Harrington's death. It had become a battle against time itself, to uncover the truth before it was wiped clean, leaving only silence and suspicion behind. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, one thought steadied him. If the evidence vanished whenever it touched official hands, then the answer lay not in trusting procedure, but in outwitting the enemy. The guilty could destroy papers and tins and ledgers, but they could not so easily erase the cracks in their own behavior. And Whimsy, with his keen eye for the smallest irregularity, resolved to watch all the closer. For in this game of vanishing evidence, the truth itself had become the rarest relic of all, and someone was willing to kill again to keep it hidden. The following morning dawned cold and grey, with a mist that clung to the streets like smoke. Whimsy, still preoccupied with the missing tin and the half-burned ledger, had barely begun to outline his next steps when a frantic message arrived from Weatherby. His face, tight with concern, greeted Whimsy at the door. "It's happened," the inspector said, his voice low. "Another death." At Harrington's former home, Whimsy's pulse quickened. Another death, and so soon after the first. "What happened?" he asked, stepping inside, careful to avoid the dripping puddles on the steps. "A Mr. Holton," Weatherby began, rubbing his temples. He was an acquaintance of Harrington, worked in the same engineering circles. "Found in the library this morning. Stabbed, and the pattern of the wound is unusual." The inspector's eyes darted nervously. "We found no signs of forced entry. And nothing was stolen, except for a small notebook he carried, possibly containing notes on Harrington's work. It's gone." Whimsy's brow furrowed. Holton had been a minor figure, scarcely connected to the scandal surrounding Roland, or so it seemed. Yet the disappearance of his notebook suggested otherwise. "So someone is still after Harrington's secrets," he said, stepping carefully into the fog-laden street. "And they will go to any lengths to ensure they are never revealed." At the scene, the library was unnervingly quiet. Bunter followed close behind, noting the disturbed papers and a faint smudge of mud near the French doors. Whimsy crouched beside Holton's body, eyes scanning the floor, the furniture, every detail. The stab wound was precise, clinical almost. A single, deliberate motion. "This was meant to send a message," he murmured. "Not just to silence him, but to frighten anyone else who might be looking." Bunter noted the odd placement of books on the shelves, and Whimsy's attention shifted. "Look at this," he said, touching a volume at the top. The book tilted oddly, as if someone had removed a hidden compartment. Inside was nothing. Just the hollow space where Holton's notebook might have been stored temporarily. He may have suspected the notebook was a target, Whimsy murmured, but he underestimated the speed and cunning of the thief. Weatherby, pacing near the doorway, muttered, "Another person who had no business being involved, now dead. How are we to connect these threads? Whimsy's mind worked rapidly. The first murder had pointed to Roland, the missing tin, the burned ledger, all signs that someone was manipulating events to conceal a larger secret. Now, Halton's death demonstrated that the culprit was not only meticulous, but willing to escalate. Whimsy's gaze fell on the smudged footprints near the doors. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but leading toward the garden. The criminal is methodical, and yet reckless when provoked, he said. They leave breadcrumbs only to mislead. Yet the pattern is there for those willing to see it. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived at Whimsy's residence. Unsigned but unmistakably meant for him. It read, "Stop your meddling, or the next one will be someone you care about. The past must remain buried." Bunter, reading over his shoulder, grimaced. "My lord, it is a threat. Someone wants to intimidate you into inaction." Whimsy's eyes, cold and calculating, narrowed. "Or they want me to act rashly. Either way, it confirms my suspicion the criminal is not merely hiding evidence. They are orchestrating events. Playing a game in which only they know the rules." The next morning, Whimsy returned to the yard, examining the scene of the missing tin once again. With Weatherby's reluctant permission, he retraced every step, every transfer of evidence. Something felt off. The supposed, secure, path from the workshop to the evidence room had been tampered with, subtly, in ways that would not alert normal inspectors. "Look here," Whimsy said, pointing to the worn edges of a floorboard near the evidence room. "Notice the scratch marks. Someone has used this hidden route, likely to remove the tin." As they examined the floor, Bunter spotted something unusual near the window, a faint residue, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. A silvery powder. Whimsy crouched and ran his gloved fingers over it. "Graphite," he said softly. "Used in lock mechanisms, or to leave a discreet mark." His gaze sharpened. "Our thief is precise, knowledgeable about mechanics. And perhaps not alone." The revelation struck a chilling note. The criminal could very well be familiar with Scotland Yard's operations, a person comfortable moving within supposedly secure spaces. Whimsy considered the suspects already identified: the financier Latham, the housekeeper Ellen, even Roland himself, but none matched this profile perfectly. Whoever had stolen the tin and burned the ledger was at least 2 steps ahead, and now they had escalated to murder. By evening, Whimsy decided to confront Roland. The man's eyes widened as Whimsy entered, a mixture of fear and defiance visible in his expression. "I have no interest in Halton's death," Roland protested, voice trembling. "I swear. I never took anything from the yard. That tin, that ledger, they are not with me." Whimsy, observing carefully, noted subtle tells. A micro-expression of relief when Halton's death was mentioned, a slight twitch when the word "yard" was spoken. "Perhaps," he said, "you truly did not have the tin, but someone did, and they knew the value of its contents." Roland paled. "I don't know who would do such things. You do know something, or else you wouldn't have burned the note from the solicitor." Whimsy countered. "You were warned. Someone in your circle is protecting interests that must remain secret. The question is, can you identify them before they strike again?" Roland's shoulders sagged, a sign of surrender, but no names fell. Whimsy left, knowing that the trail was growing darker by the hour. Whoever controlled Harrington's hidden legacy had proven ruthless. Now, it was not just a matter of solving a crime, but preventing another death. And perhaps, finally uncovering the full scope of the villain's design. As Whimsy returned home that night, he paused at the window overlooking the fog-choked streets. Somewhere in London, the criminal watched. calculating the next move. The city had become a chessboard, and for the first time, Whimsy felt the sharp edge of danger closing in, knowing that a single misstep could cost not only justice but life itself. A shadow moved across the street, unnoticed by any but him. And in that fleeting silhouette, Whimsy saw the chilling certainty: the game was far from over, and the next twist was already in motion. The fog that had blanketed the city through the night lingered well into morning, dulling the outlines of roofs and lampposts, as though London itself were reluctant to reveal its secrets. Whimsy had spent a restless night, the letter's threat gnawing at him, Halton's murder weighing heavily on his thoughts. He sat now in his study, papers scattered across the table, every note and observation laid bare before him. Bunter, precise as ever, placed a steaming cup of coffee at his side but said nothing. Silence suited Whimsy's mood, and silence, he knew, was often the best companion when searching for a pattern buried beneath the noise. He leafed once more through the statements. Rowland's evasions, Ellen's quiet loyalty, Latham's polished words, Halton's truncated testimony, and Harrington's fragments of work. They sprawled like pieces of a puzzle without corners, refusing to assemble into coherence. Yet Whimsy had learned that when the pieces resisted, the fault was not always theirs but his own, for failing to notice the seam where one shape brushed another. His eye paused on a single line scribbled in the margin of his notes. Tin marked not with Harrington's initials, but with a faint symbol resembling a circle divided by a line. It had struck him as peculiar when first mentioned, yet amid the tumult of missing evidence and smouldering ledgers, the detail had seemed too small to pursue. Now, in the cold light of a new day, it pressed itself forward. He remembered Rowland's insistence that he never touched the tin, and Ellen's odd remark, something about how Harrington had always marked things his own way, never trusting names where symbols might do. At the time, it had seemed an eccentricity, but perhaps it was more. Perhaps it was the very key. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Bunter," he said suddenly, "do you recall the broken protractor found in Harrington's workshop? The one everyone assumed a trifling relic of his engineering days." "Yes, my lord," Bunter replied, attentive. It lay among the ordinary tools, cracked clean through as if by accident. And yet, Whimsy mused, it bore a mark very like that on the tin, a circle bisected, a simple symbol overlooked by all. But what if it was not decorative? What if Harrington devised a system, a cipher of sorts, where each marked item belonged to a chain of knowledge? The tin, the protractor, perhaps even that blasted ledger. Pieces of a sequence, and we have mistaken them for clutter. The thought electrified him. He rose abruptly, pacing the room. It is not chance that Halton's notebook disappeared. It must have borne the same mark. The murderer is not destroying evidence randomly. They are following the chain, eliminating each link before it leads to the whole. Bunter's brow furrowed. Then, my lord, whoever pursues this chain must know it well, perhaps better than anyone alive. Indeed, Whimsy said, voice taut. Which means our villain is not some distant interloper, but someone who lived within Harrington's world, who knew his habits and the symbols he employed. He stopped short, turning the thought over. Rowland swore ignorance of the tin's markings. Ellen mentioned them in passing, as if she thought them no more than quirks. Latham said nothing of them at all. And Halton died because his notebook bore one. The pattern began to shimmer through the fog, faint yet undeniable. 4 deaths and thefts that, taken separately, seemed chaotic, yet all tied by the thread of Harrington's symbol. The realization both thrilled and chilled him. If the killer hunted every marked item, then the danger was far from ended, for who knew how many such tokens Harrington had left behind? That evening, he paid another visit to Ellen under the pretense of clarifying small domestic details. She received him nervously, hands wringing in her apron. Wimsey's manner was light, almost conversational, but every question weighed carefully. He asked after Harrington's habits, how he stored his papers, whether he left behind journals or sketches. Ellen, flustered, recalled how he had a fondness for locking away scraps in odd places, false bottoms in drawers, hollow books, even a loose tile in the hearth. Always said it was safer that way, she murmured. He didn't trust names or labels, thought they drew the eye. Better to mark with signs only he knew. Her words struck like a spark to kindling. And did you ever notice a symbol? Wimsey asked casually. She frowned, thinking. Oh yes, sir. A circle and a line. He scratched it into things he wanted set apart. Said it kept order in his own mind. Wimsey's eyes gleamed, though he masked it with a mild nod. The pattern was undeniable now. Harrington's personal cipher had become the map for murder. Someone else had recognized it. Someone who understood its significance well enough to hunt every marked item down. When he departed, the mist had thickened again, wrapping the street in ghostly silence. He stood a moment at the corner, deep in thought. It was not the tin or the ledger, or even Halton's notebook, that mattered most. It was the system, the web Harrington had left behind. To break the cipher would be to uncover the secret worth killing for. But equally, to follow it blindly was to invite the killer's blade. The memory of Roland's twitch, Latham's polished evasions, Ellen's anxious loyalty, all shuffled and resettled in his mind. Each suspect had been touched by Harrington's world, each bore a connection that could explain part of the chain. But who among them had the will and the cunning to pursue it to bloodshed? That night, as he sat once more in his study, the fire throwing restless shadows across the walls, Wimsey spread his notes anew and drew the symbol at the center, a circle divided by a line. Around it, he wrote the objects. The tin, the protractor, the ledger, Halton's notebook. He added Roland, Ellen, Latham, and Harrington himself. Slowly, the links began to arrange themselves. The pattern was not yet whole, but it was no longer shapeless. The outline of the truth pressed faintly against the veil. And Wimsey knew with certainty that the key had been before him all along. It was no longer a question of whether the pattern existed, but whether he could follow it to its end, before the killer struck again. And as the embers glowed low in the grate, Wimsey whispered into the silence, "The game tightens, the circle closes." The following morning dawned clear but cold, a brittle wind slicing through the streets as Wimsey made his way to Harrington's workshop one final time. He had not yet shared his suspicions with anyone, preferring to let the threads of the pattern speak first. Inside, the room was quiet, almost reverent in its stillness. The scattered tools and papers, now faintly illuminated by the sun filtering through dust, mottled panes. Each object seemed to wait for recognition. Each scrap of paper a sentinel guarding a truth long buried. He began with the tin, the protractor, and Halton's ledger, laying them out in sequence. To the untrained eye, they were ordinary remnants of a man's work, but Wimsey saw the faint scratches, the circle bisected by a line, etched deliberately into each surface. He traced them with a finger, considering, imagining the mind that had created them. It was not just a system of organization, it was a language, and someone had learned it well enough to wield it with deadly precision. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of cautious footsteps outside. Bunter had returned, hat in hand, bearing a small envelope. "My lord," he said quietly, This was left at the door just after sunrise. No indication of a messenger, and the seal bears no mark I recognize. Whimsy accepted it and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting precise yet oddly familiar. It contained no threats, only a brief note. You have seen the surface, but not the depth. Look beneath the motive, or the pattern ends with more blood. A chill ran down his spine. The message was clever, a challenge rather than a warning. And it confirmed what he had long suspected: the murderer was both bold and deeply invested, psychologically intertwined with the events in a way that went beyond material gain. This was not the work of someone seeking money or professional advantage. It was personal. He sat for a long moment, reconstructing what he knew. Roland had motive in the past, certainly, but his actions had been too shallow, reactive rather than calculated. Latham's evasions were troubling, but lacked the obsessive precision displayed in the thefts and murders. Ellen, loyal almost to a fault, had access but not ambition. And yet the pattern, so elegantly cruel, demanded intimate knowledge of Harrington's symbols and habits, knowledge that only someone close enough to study him, admire him, and ultimately envy or fear him could possess. Then it struck him. A memory surfaced. An old case file buried in the corner of his mind. A minor dispute years ago involving Harrington and a fellow engineer. One that had escalated into quiet professional ruin for the other party. He had dismissed it at the time as a trifling matter, overshadowed by larger, more immediate concerns. But now, in the context of the current murders, it bore a significance impossible to ignore. He fetched the dusty file and spread it open. There it was. Harrington had been involved in patent disputes, intellectual disagreements, and subtle professional betrayals. But the most striking detail was the signature, faint and almost imperceptible on one document, of a man named Carraway, a rival engineer dismissed from society circles, humiliated professionally yet never entirely forgotten. Whimsy's mind raced. Carraway had been in the shadows for years, forgotten by everyone except perhaps Harrington himself. And someone who had been humiliated so thoroughly might nurture not mere resentment, but an obsession. The pieces clicked into place. The killings, the thefts, the careful targeting of symbols, all pointed toward more than vengeance. They were an elaborate ritual of retribution, a psychological assertion of dominance over the memory of a man whose intellect had overshadowed him. Carraway, long overlooked, had returned not merely to settle accounts, but to assert control over the legacy of Harrington, demonstrating that he could manipulate the world according to his own rules, bending symbols, items, and even human lives to his will. He looked at the scattered objects again: the tin, the protractor, the ledger, Halton's notebook. None had intrinsic value, but each represented an element of Harrington's ordered life, now hijacked by a mind bent on demonstrating superiority. It was a subtle cruelty, a test of perception, daring the world to recognize the method behind the madness. Whimsy's pulse quickened. The understanding of motive was both exhilarating and terrifying, for it meant the killer's next moves could now be predicted. But the psychological stakes were far higher than any material threat. Bunter observed him silently, sensing the shift in his lord's demeanor. Whimsy rose and began pacing, muttering under his breath. It is not enough to follow the pattern blindly. One must anticipate the compulsion behind it, the ego, the obsession, the envy. Only then can one intercept the mind before it strikes again. By midday, Whimsy had compiled a mental map of the likely target's objects, documents, even people, whose connection to Harrington might invite Carraway's intervention. It was precise and dangerous work, requiring careful orchestration. He instructed Bunter to arrange surveillance at several key locations and to report any unusual movement immediately. Every detail mattered: a displaced ledger, a visitor at an odd hour, even a casual comment that betrayed knowledge beyond ordinary acquaintance. As the day wore on, a report came in from the south wing of Harrington's former estate. A local shopkeeper had noticed a man, tall, meticulous, with sharp eyes, lingering near the property and asking questions about Harrington's habits, his storage of papers, and symbols only those who knew him could recognize. Wimsey's stomach tightened. Carraway had not merely re-emerged, he was already moving, probing, testing the vigilance of those who sought to uncover him. That evening, Wimsey returned to his study, the fire now a low red glow, shadows dancing against the walls like silent observers. He laid out the evidence anew, connecting each object and observation with pencil marks. The pattern had emerged fully in his mind. The symbols were keys, the killings were proofs, and the motive, a twisted blend of revenge and intellectual assertion, was clear. Carraway sought not wealth, not position, but acknowledgement of his superiority, a perverse declaration that he alone could manipulate and dominate the legacy of Harrington. He leaned back, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of comprehension settle upon him. The crime was no longer random, and the danger no longer abstract. He now understood not only the path the murderer would follow, but why every move was made with deliberate cruelty and intellectual pride. Carraway's obsession was the engine behind the horror, and knowing it offered Wimsey both advantage and a grim responsibility. Outside, the city had darkened into twilight, the streets humming with an indifferent life. Yet within the quiet study, the detective felt a surge of grim determination. The motive was revealed, the villain's psychology mapped, and with it, the final steps toward confrontation began to take shape. Carraway's shadow loomed large, yet it was now a shadow that Wimsey could anticipate, predict, and, if all went according to plan, intercept. He glanced at Bunter, who waited silently, understanding that the next phase required not merely vigilance but courage. "We have the motive," Wimsey said, voice low but firm. "We know why he acts, and that is all the advantage we need. The rest is a matter of patience and precision." And as the flames flickered against the walls, illuminating the scattered symbols and notes, Wimsey knew the investigation had reached its true turning point. The hidden motive revealed the mind behind the crime, and in exposing that obsession, he held the key not only to solving the case, but to preventing the next calculated strike. Carraway was still out there, but the detective no longer merely followed, he was ready to lead. The streets were quiet that night, the city wrapped in a thin mist that blurred lamplight into soft halos. Wimsey and Bunter moved with careful precision, navigating the narrow lanes toward Carraway's likely refuge, a small, disused warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial quarter. Weeks of observation, deduction, and patient surveillance had narrowed the villain's movements to a predictable rhythm, and tonight, Wimsey intended to end the game he had so meticulously mapped. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the fog. Its windows were dark, the silence thick, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Wimsey paused at the edge of the street, eyes scanning for traps or watchers. Every step so far had been anticipated, and he knew Carraway's pride would tempt him to believe himself still invisible, untouchable. That arrogance would be the key. Inside, the space was a cluttered chaos of old machinery, crates, and scattered papers. Yet there was an eerie order to it. A reflection of the man who had orchestrated a series of murders and thefts with meticulous precision. Wimsey moved silently, every sense alert, every footfall calculated. He had set up contingencies outside, escape routes, reinforcements, and signaling points were all ready. Now, it was time to draw the predator into the light. He stepped into the center of the room. Voice calm but carrying authority. "Carraway," he called. "I know why you've done all of this. I understand your method, your obsession. There is no need to escalate further." From the shadows, a figure emerged. Tall, angular, eyes glinting with sharp intellect and simmering fury. Carraway's expression was a mask of polite curiosity, but there was a flicker of unease in the corners of his gaze. "So?" he said, voice smooth. The great detective finally sees through the veil. "And what do you intend to do with this knowledge, I wonder? Will you commend me for my ingenuity, or simply try to bind me in your trifling lore?" Whimsy advanced slowly, maintaining a deliberate calm. "You have a choice," he said evenly. "Surrender and explain yourself, or continue this cycle and risk the consequences. I know the full extent of your obsession with Harrington, and I know the next move you were planning. There is nowhere to hide, Carraway." A sharp laugh escaped the man, low and controlled, yet tinged with panic. "Do you truly think you understand me? You see patterns, motives, all neatly tied. But I am beyond such trivialities. I do what is necessary. I shape reality according to my vision. No man, no detective, can constrain me." The bravado was a mask, Whimsy noted, just as Bunter's earlier observation had suggested. A closer examination of Carraway's posture, the tight grip on the edge of a nearby crate, the quick flicker of his gaze toward the warehouse exit, revealed something else: fear. The fear of exposure. The fear of having his intellectual dominion interrupted. That subtle crack in his composure was all Whimsy needed. "Your vision," Whimsy said, "stepping nearer, has already led to ruin. Innocent lives are lost, and your triumph is hollow. Every symbol you manipulated, every theft and murder, it was all to prove a point only you care about. But obsession cannot create legacy. Only truth endures, and tonight, that truth confronts you." Carraway's eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat, the room held a tense equilibrium. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted toward a pile of papers on a high shelf. Whimsy anticipated the movement instantly. Bunter, positioned at the opposite side, readied himself to intercept any attempt at destruction or escape. "Do not," Whimsy warned. "Every move you make is known to us. There is no advantage left." Carraway froze, breathing shallow, calculating, before his defenses wavered. For a fleeting moment, the meticulous composure gave way to a raw, human panic. The man's hand trembled slightly, brushing against the ledger that had once belonged to Harrington. A ledger he had coveted as a symbol of intellectual conquest. Whimsy recognized the significance immediately. The ledger was the linchpin of his pattern. The proof that connected all the crimes, the piece Carraway could not destroy without acknowledging his own guilt. "It is all here," Whimsy continued. Voice gentle but firm, "the motive, the methods, the madness. You cannot rewrite history tonight. You cannot erase what has been done." Carraway's face contorted, a mixture of defiance and desperation. "Then you would have me captured, imprisoned, punished." He laughed again, but it lacked conviction. "I am beyond such fates." "You cannot bind genius in chains." "But you are bound." "Carraway," Whimsy replied softly, "bound by your own choices, by your own obsession. And tonight, you have the opportunity to end this without further loss of life." For a long, tense moment, the only sound was Carraway's uneven breathing and the distant hum of the city beyond the warehouse walls. Then, almost imperceptibly, he released the ledger, letting it thud to the floor. Whimsy stepped forward, taking possession of the document while Bunter moved to secure the perimeter. "You see," Whimsy said quietly, or confession is not always in words. Sometimes it is in the surrender of the very object that embodies your intent. You have chosen, in that small act, to acknowledge the truth. That is all that is required tonight. Carraway sank into a chair, the tension in his frame dissipating only slightly. "You understand me," he murmured. "You see what I sought to prove, yet you are not fooled by it." "How?" "Observation," Whimsy said simply. "Pattern recognition, yes, but more importantly, understanding the human need beneath it. You sought dominion over Harrington's intellect because it represented your unfulfilled ambition, your wounded pride. That need dictated your actions. And in surrendering the ledger, you have admitted that truth to yourself." The man's eyes, sharp yet wary, met Whimsy's. For the first time, there was no mask, no pretense, just recognition of failure, of obsession confronted, and the finality of consequence. The quiet was broken by the distant sound of sirens. The authorities, pre-positioned, had begun to converge on the warehouse. Carraway did not resist as Whimsy gestured for Bunter to step forward. "It is over," Whimsy said. "The pattern has been broken, and the truth preserved. There will be justice, yes, but no more lives need be lost." As the police entered to take Carraway into custody, the detective allowed himself a brief, rare smile. The danger, the tension, and the elaborate chase of intellect had reached its natural conclusion. Every symbol, every act, every subtle manipulation had been accounted for, and the man whose obsession had terrorized so many was now contained. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the streets under a pale, indifferent moon. Whimsy and Bunter stepped into the cool night air, the city around them resuming its muted rhythm. Yet within the detective, a quiet satisfaction lingered, calm, precise and earned. Carraway's shadow had loomed large, but understanding his motive, predicting his moves, and finally confronting him with clarity, had ensured that the pattern, no matter how intricate, was now broken. The case that had begun with thefts and murders, symbols and cryptic messages, had ended in a final confrontation that left no ambiguity, no loose threads. The truth, in all its complexity, had been laid bare. And as they walked away from the warehouse, Whimsy reflected on the subtle brilliance of the investigation. It had been the careful observation of human nature, the recognition of obsession, and the patience to wait for the final move that had made victory not just possible, but inevitable. In the stillness of the night, amidst the quieted chaos, the detective knew that justice, in its most intricate form, had been served. The city had settled into a deceptive quiet after Carraway's capture. For days, the streets seemed almost ordinary, and the press had already begun to frame the case as solved. Whimsy, however, never allowed complacency to settle over his thoughts. The ledger, now safely secured at Scotland Yard, had revealed the intricate motives and methods of Carraway, but something in the margins of his notes had unsettled Whimsy. An anomaly, small but deliberate, that hinted at a hand beyond the man who had so meticulously constructed his crimes. It began with a line of seemingly random symbols, scribbled in a corner of the ledger, overlooked by the authorities and the eager reporters alike. To anyone else, they were mere flourishes, the obsessive doodles of a brilliant mind under strain. But to Whimsy, they were a signature, a faint echo of another intellect, a mind that had perhaps guided Carraway, coaxed him into acts that might otherwise have remained unrealized. Bunter noticed Whimsy's furrowed brow before he spoke. "You're not satisfied, sir," he said quietly, as they walked along the embankment by the Thames. The river shimmered under the moonlight, mirroring the restless thoughts that churned in Whimsy's mind. "No," Whimsy admitted, his fingers tracing the outline of the ledger in his coat pocket. Carraway is clever, yes, but he is not the whole story. These symbols, they are too methodical, too deliberate to be mere distractions. Someone else may have orchestrated the sequence, guiding him toward outcomes beneficial only to themselves. Bunter's expression tightened. Do you think there's another criminal at large? Someone who has been hiding in plain sight all along? Whimsy nodded. It is possible. And if so, they would be counting on Carraway's capture to make their work appear complete. That is the danger of underestimating a mind capable of seeing several moves ahead. Back at the warehouse, now sealed as evidence, Whimsy examined the ledger in isolation, cross-referencing Carraway's notes with known patterns from other unsolved cases. A series of small, seemingly insignificant errors and contradictions suddenly formed a faint, consistent rhythm. One that did not originate from Carraway. The realization struck him. Someone had manipulated him into believing the pattern had been fully exposed. A sharp knock at the door startled him. It was Inspector Lestrade, holding a telegram marked urgent. Thought you'd want to see this first, Lestrade said. Whimsy accepted the paper, scanning the terse lines. It described a theft at the Royal Society archives. A collection of rare manuscripts and correspondences connected to Carraway's earlier work. Nothing seemed missing at first glance, yet one name appeared repeatedly among the catalogued items. The same name that had surfaced briefly in Carraway's ledger, a figure who had supposedly been a quiet academic colleague, unconnected to the crimes. The twist, Whimsy murmured, eyes narrowing. This was no oversight. The so-called colleague is not just peripheral, they are the architect, the true puppeteer. Carraway was merely the instrument, brilliant but blind to the wider design. Bunter leaned over the ledger. And that explains the symbols, sir. They were directions, coded instructions from the real mastermind. Yes, Whimsy replied. Carraway may have thought he was working independently, but he was following an invisible hand. Every murder, every theft, every calculated distraction. It was orchestrated to conceal a deeper objective. The pattern became increasingly clear as Whimsy traced the timeline of Carraway's movements and compared them with minor incidents previously dismissed. Misfiled letters, small financial discrepancies, unexplained visits to obscure addresses. They were breadcrumbs leading not to Carraway, but to someone entirely unexpected. Professor Alastair Fincher, a respected historian and cryptographer, a man whose reputation had shielded him from suspicion. Fincher's motivations were more convoluted than simple malice or financial gain. He had long sought to control the narrative of intellectual supremacy, to prove that genius could be manipulated, even weaponized. Carraway had been chosen for his brilliance and his vulnerability to ego. Fincher's orchestration had been meticulous, ensuring that even the sharpest observer would be drawn toward Carraway, never suspecting the true hand behind the curtain. Whimsy now understood the depth of the deception. Every crime scene, every altered ledger entry, every sudden misdirection, it had all been intended to lull him into a false sense of closure. The danger was not over. Fincher, aware that Carraway was captured, would likely act quickly to eliminate the ledger itself and any witnesses who could connect him to the crimes. Bunter, sensing the urgency, asked, "Sir, what do we do next?" Whimsy's eyes gleamed with a renewed focus, sharp as the edge of a scalpel. "We bait him. Fincher believes himself untouchable, yet he underestimates our patience and precision. We will use Carraway's capture and the ledger as lure, presenting the illusion that the trail ends there. And then, when he attempts his next move, we will be waiting." The following days were a delicate dance of misdirection and surveillance. Whimsy orchestrated a controlled leak, allowing a select circle of trusted officials to know that the ledger contained key evidence, that Carraway had confessed to all, but leaving subtle, suggestive errors that only an informed observer would notice. Meanwhile, Bunter tracked Fincher's communications, movements, were in contacts with an almost surgical precision, noting every interaction that might betray his intentions. It was a subtle psychological game, designed to exploit Fincher's ego. Whimsy predicted that Fincher could not resist the chance to secure or destroy the ledger himself, to assert ultimate control over the narrative he had created. The trap was set in the most understated manner, a simple appointment at the Royal Society, framed as a private viewing of the ledger's contents, with cameras, surveillance, and reinforcements hidden discreetly around the building. On the appointed day, the air was tense, heavy with the unspoken anticipation of confrontation. Fincher arrived, demeanor impeccably composed. Yet the smallest signs, tapping fingers, glances toward exits, the slight pallor of his skin, betrayed a man uneasy in his own scheme. "Professor Fincher?" Whimsy greeted him with calm precision. "I trust you have reviewed Carraway's confessions." Fincher's eyes flickered briefly, masking irritation with polite civility. "I have seen nothing yet, Detective Whimsy. I prefer to judge evidence firsthand." A quiet smile tugged at Whimsy's lips. "Excellent. Then you will understand when I say that every move, every manipulation, has been accounted for. You are here, and so is your pattern." For the first time, Fincher's composure cracked. His gaze darted toward the hidden surveillance, calculating risks, weighing escape. Whimsy allowed the pause to linger, every second tightening the psychological noose. "You underestimated Carraway," Whimsy continued softly. "And in doing so, you underestimated me. But the ledger does not lie. The truth, as always, reveals itself, even when the mastermind believes themselves invisible." Fincher's lips parted, as if to protest, yet the weight of evidence, the orchestration of the trap, and the undeniable clarity of Whimsy's deductions left him frozen. The brilliance that had orchestrated countless crimes, that had guided another to execute them, was now ensnared by its own meticulousness. The final twist, the revelation that the true villain had been lurking in plain sight, sent a ripple through the case that no one could have anticipated. And in that moment, Whimsy knew that the intricate web of manipulation, the labyrinthine plotting, and the hidden motives had all converged, not merely to test his intellect, but to define the very limits of justice and ingenuity. As the authorities moved to secure Fincher, Whimsy and Bunter exchanged a brief glance, the weight of the revelation settling over them. The case that had seemed concluded had unfolded one final time, proving that in the world of intellect, the sharpest blade is always the mind, and even then, the mind must remain vigilant to the last, unexpected twist. The ledger, the confessions, the careful orchestration of observation, they were all in place. And now at last, the tangled web of deception was ready to be unraveled completely. The day had drawn on, the sun casting long, golden streaks across the cobbled streets of London, yet inside the Royal Society, the tension remained electric, unbroken by the ordinary rhythm of life beyond its walls. Fincher had been apprehended without incident, led away in the quiet efficiency that only Scotland Yard could manage. Yet Whimsy's eyes did not rest, nor did the subtle curl of his lips betray the satisfaction he felt. He knew that in a case as intricate as this, appearances were often deceiving. He turned to Bunter, who had been meticulously cataloguing Fincher's possessions for evidence. "Observe carefully, Bunter," Whimsy said, voice low. "For the true resolution of this case is not in the capture itself, but in the explanation of the invisible threads that connected every act, every crime, every misdirection. Bunter nodded, understanding that his role was not simply clerical, but analytical. "You mean, sir, the hidden hand, the mastermind subtleties that guided Carraway?" "Precisely," Whimsy replied, moving toward the ledger. He opened it once more, allowing the morning light to fall across the pages. Every symbol, every irregular notation, where every minor discrepancy was now illuminated with a clarity previously obscured by Carraway's apparent autonomy. Whimsy traced the line of a particularly subtle cipher, pointing to a sequence of numbers and letters that had been dismissed by investigators as meaningless doodling. "These," he said softly, "were instructions, but not merely for Carraway. They were a message to anyone who knew how to read them, a hidden signature. A breadcrumb trail that led directly to Fincher. The man believed he had hidden himself behind another's brilliance, yet his ego betrayed him in the minutest of details. A letter misfiled, a decimal point shifted, a day off, the weak inconsistency in the journals, all intentional yet all revealing. Most overlooked them. I did not." Bunter leaned closer, eyes widening. "And that's why we saw him manipulating every stage, sir. Every crime scene, every death, every theft. They were parts of a larger design we barely glimpsed until now." "Yes," Whimsy said, his tone uncharacteristically quiet, as though speaking aloud might shatter the fragile coherence of the truth he had assembled. "The elegance of the design is in its simplicity. Fincher's ultimate objective was not merely to commit crimes, but to create a narrative of control, to demonstrate the invisibility of genius. Carraway was the instrument, we were the audience." But even as the ledger lay open and the pieces aligned, a gnawing unease remained. Something about Fincher's movements, the precision of his manipulation, hinted at contingencies beyond Carraway's involvement. Whimsy felt it in the tautness of his own anticipation, a tension that whispered of unfinished threads. He dismissed it as the residue of over-analysis until Bunter, checking the room one last time, discovered a folded sheet of paper tucked into the back of a drawer. The sheet contained a coded set of instructions, obscure but unmistakable once one knew how to interpret the sequence. Whimsy's eyes lit up as he deciphered the contents. They were directions, a map of planned moves, perhaps even escape routes that Fincher had laid in reserve for contingencies. The trap had worked, or yet the man's mind had anticipated the possibility of capture. A final contingency, a ghost of an escape, existed within the very documents he had left behind. Bunter looked to Whimsy, unease creeping into his expression. "Do you mean he could still get away?" "Sir," Whimsy allowed himself a small, rueful smile. "It is always possible, Bunter. A mind such as Fincher's does not concede defeat easily. Yet, even if he tries, every action is constrained by his own overconfidence. Justice, in some form, is inevitable, but the form it takes may not be the one we expect." With careful precision, Whimsy relayed the discovery to Lestrade, who organized additional surveillance and security around Fincher's remaining known contacts and properties. The sense of urgency was palpable. Every move had to be anticipated, every loophole closed. Yet even amidst this preparation, Whimsy allowed a quiet meditation on the irony of the situation. Fincher's genius had been both his weapon and his cage. In attempting to control the narrative, he had left the very keys to his capture embedded in his own design. Hours later, as evening fell, Whimsy gathered those involved in the investigation, providing a full exposition of the case that left no detail unexamined. He traced the sequence from Carraway's first minor manipulations, through the carefully staged murders, the misdirection of authorities, and the subtle psychological cues planted throughout. Each step was illuminated, every false lead reinterpreted as part of the larger pattern, culminating in the revelation of Fincher as the true architect. The beauty of this, Whimsy concluded, voice steady and commanding, lies not merely in the apprehension of the man, but in understanding the invisible hand. Most investigators saw only the instrument, the crimes themselves, and were content. But the true lesson is that genius, unchecked, leaves footprints, even when it believes itself unseen. The assembled officers murmured among themselves, comprehension dawning. Yet as they absorbed the narrative, a sudden interruption came in the form of a brief, coded message intercepted by Bunter's keen vigilance, an untraceable communication, indicating a meeting far from the city, away from the eyes of the authorities. The implications were immediate and chilling. Fincher had anticipated contingencies beyond even the careful planning of Scotland Yard. He may have been in custody, but not all his plans had been neutralized. Whimsy's eyes narrowed, tracing the lines of the message with the same exacting focus he had applied to the ledger. "Even now," he murmured, "the game continues. It is a final, imperfect echo of his ambition. We may have captured the body, but the mind, the ingenuity, may yet persist in shadow." Bunter's lips tightened in thought. "So, justice is served, sir?" Whimsy paused, gaze distant yet sharply focused. "Justice, yes, in its immediate and tangible form. Fincher will face the consequences of his direct actions. But genius such as his does not vanish so easily. It leaves traces, questions, puzzles, a sense of unfinished business that will linger in the minds of those who witnessed it." He closed the ledger gently, as if putting a capstone on the intricacy of the crimes. This is why observation, deduction, and vigilance are paramount. The clues were always there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the mind willing to see beyond the obvious. And though we may celebrate today, we remain aware that the game, the dance of intellect and deception, never truly ends. As they left the Royal Society that evening, the city lights flickered across wet pavements, reflecting a world that seemed calm yet remained fraught with hidden movements, unseen intentions. Whimsy walked with Bunter. The silence between them filled not with relief, but with the sharp clarity of minds alert to the lingering possibilities. Justice had been delivered, yes. Yet in its shadow, a whisper persisted: the game was never truly over, and the final, elusive twist of genius might still wait in the corners, unseen, ready to emerge. And so, with a measured step and eyes unyielding, Whimsy led the way, ever vigilant, ever aware that, in the delicate balance of intellect and criminality, the line between closure and continuation is never quite certain. The city breathed around them, unaware that one more puzzle, one last shadow, still lingered beyond the immediate triumph. A reminder that even the most meticulous of plans could leave threads dangling, teasing the mind with the possibility of a return, a final, unresolved challenge. Even as the night deepened, London remained cloaked in its usual mixture of fog and lamplight, the streets echoing faintly with the steps of late wanderers. Whimsy moved through the city with measured calm, Bunter close behind, the events of the past days settling into a tense but coherent narrative in his mind. Fincher's capture had brought closure of a sort, yet the detective felt no sense of finality, only the lingering echo of a question he could not yet articulate. The ledger, now carefully returned to the Royal Society's secure archives, had revealed the patterns, exposed the motive, and demonstrated the brilliance and folly of Fincher's mind. Yet as Whimsy reviewed every step in his memory, the misdirections, the subtle manipulations, the small notes hidden in plain sight, one detail persisted, insistent and out of place. It was the faint, almost imperceptible ink smudge on the final page of Carraway's journal, overlooked by every investigator, even by himself at first glance. The smudge had seemed trivial, an accidental blot, yet he now recognized it as deliberate, a message of sorts, encoded in a manner so subtle that it could have been dismissed by any casual observer. "Bunter," he murmured, voice thoughtful, "notice this mark here." At first, it seemed irrelevant, merely a lapse of attention. But the pattern of the ink, the pressure, the sequence of its placement, it is intentional. Someone wanted this to be noticed, yet only by the most attentive. Bunter leaned closer, frowning. "But sir, who could leave such a message? Fincher is already in custody, and Carraway, well, we accounted for him." Whimsy's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. "Precisely. That is why it cannot be dismissed. If Fincher orchestrated it, then it is a contingency, a hint of something he wanted to remain unresolved. If it was another hand, then the scope of the game is wider than we imagined. Either way, we are not finished. Something remains to be discovered." As they walked along the misted Thames, the city seemed to hold its breath. The faint ripple of the river mirrored the subtle tension in Whimsy's mind. Though outwardly serene, he sensed the currents of intrigue still running beneath the surface. Even the apparent resolution, the arrest, the confessions, the mapping of the pattern, was only a chapter, not the conclusion. Returning to his study that evening, Whimsy spread the relevant documents on his desk, re-examining the smudge, the odd notation, and the peculiar placement of certain words in Carraway's journal. Slowly, deliberately, he traced connections between the minor irregularities and Fincher's known tendencies. The patterns were there, subtle yet undeniable, a sequence of letters, mirrored inversions, the spacing of certain entries, all pointing toward a single lingering enigma. "It is a signal," Whimsy said softly, almost to himself. "A reminder that no case is ever truly complete. Genius leaves traces beyond the immediate, and those traces are intended to challenge, to provoke curiosity, to demand the mind's continued engagement. Fincher may be in custody, but his intellect, like a spectre, remains at large, teasing us with unfinished business." Bunter, ever meticulous, examined the documents again. "Do you think someone else is involved, sir? A hidden accomplice, perhaps, or another mind we have yet to recognize?" Whimsy allowed a brief pause, considering. "Possibly. Or it may be a final, self-contained puzzle left by Fincher. A parting gift, if you will, to the observant. It is impossible to say without further investigation. Yet that is the nature of a truly intricate design, it never reveals its entirety, even when most seems apparent." He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the city beyond the window. The fog blurred the gaslights into a soft halo, the streets below silent save for the occasional carriage. It was a world that seemed ordinary, yet he knew that hidden beneath the familiar surfaces were the seeds of countless mysteries waiting to be uncovered. He thought of the small details, the misplaced keys, the brief glance, the casual comment, each a doorway to revelation for those willing to look beyond the obvious. A knock at the door drew his attention. Bunter opened it to reveal a messenger boy, holding a plain envelope. No markings, no indication of the sender, only a faint seal that bore a strange emblem, a symbol Whimsy did not immediately recognize. With deliberate care, he broke the seal and unfolded the note inside. The message was brief, cryptic, and unsettling. "The game has only begun. Look beyond the ledger." Whimsy read it twice, the corners of his mouth curling slightly in a wry, knowing smile. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket. "Bunter," he said, eyes sharp, "it seems our respite is brief. Even in the wake of what appears to be resolution, the threads extend further than anticipated. This is the perpetual truth of our work. No answer is ever absolute, no victory final. Bunter nodded, a mixture of respect and unease in his gaze. Then, sir, another mystery awaits. Indeed, Wimsey replied, rising to his feet. But consider this: the thrill is not in certainty, but in the pursuit of understanding. Each puzzle, each minor irregularity, is a reminder that intellect and curiosity must never rest. Finch's case has ended in one sense, yet the mind that navigated it leaves echoes, footprints, and, inevitably, unanswered questions. That is the essence of mystery. It never truly concludes. The detective moved to the window, looking out at the city now fully immersed in darkness. The fog wrapped the streets like a shroud, concealing potential plots, hidden intentions, and the faint glimmer of secrets waiting to be unearthed. Somewhere in the maze of London's alleys, in the quiet rooms of unremarkable houses, or perhaps within the mind of another clever criminal, lay the beginnings of a story that would demand his attention once more. Bunter stood silently, the weight of anticipation hanging between them. The ledger, the smudge, the cryptic note, all had converged to leave a lingering impression. The narrative was not closed, merely paused. Wimsey's gaze shifted from the city to his study, to the familiar tools of deduction scattered about. The magnifying glass, the ledger, the carefully annotated maps. Observe, analyze, question. Bunter, he said quietly. Every detail holds meaning, and every meaning leads to another question. That is the true lesson of our recent endeavors. Resolution is a fleeting comfort. Understanding is the enduring pursuit. He allowed himself a moment of reflection, letting the calm of the study settle over him, yet beneath it, the thrill of discovery pulsed anew. Outside, London's fog thickened, swallowing the street lamps and shrouding the city in mystery once more. And within that fog, unseen, perhaps waiting, the faintest echo of a new challenge lingered. As the night deepened, Wimsey finally turned from the window, a quiet determination settling over him. Justice had been served, and yet the enigma remained. The case of Fincher and Carraway was closed. Yet in the intricate web of intellect and cunning, one truth persisted: mysteries never truly end. They evolve, shift, and await the mind sharp enough to follow them. And so, with Bunter at his side, Wimsey prepared for what inevitably would come next. A door had closed, yes, but another had quietly opened, its threshold veiled in shadow, hinting at secrets yet to be uncovered. The city slept, unaware that the detective's vigilance ensured the threads of truth were never abandoned, and that somewhere, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, another mystery whispered, waiting for the mind ready to discern its shape. In that quiet, deliberate moment, Wimsey understood the perpetual nature of his calling. The satisfaction of solved cases was never complete, for curiosity, once awakened, demanded continuity. And as the fog swirled outside, London became both a map and a maze, a canvas for intellect and deduction, where the next adventure quietly awaited. The mystery never ended. It merely rested, patient and teasing, until the next observer, the next mind, came to uncover its truth.